Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gul'dan is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 14 of my Knights of the Frozen Throne card review. All of the remaining cards were just revealed, so I know every single Frozen Throne card that's out there. In this review, I won't be doing the remaining 35 cards I have up for review. I'll just be doing the new Legendaries and the new class cards that were revealed today during the final live stream, and that includes 2 new Death Knights and the Lich King himself, so some pretty exciting stuff in this review. As always, detailed reviews up front, although I have to say I will be spending a little less time on the cards in this review simply because the expansion's almost here, I'm running out of time, and I gotta move quickly through these, so they won't be quite as detailed as normal, but also still quick reviews near the end of the video. If you look at the link in the description, it'll take you right there if you're just looking for quick card reveals and my overall summaries. But for now, let's go ahead and jump into these semi-detailed reviews. Up first is the Lich King himself, a new 8-mana, 8/8 taunted neutral minion with a pretty interesting effect here. It's at the end of your turn, you can add a random Death Knight card to your hand. And that does not mean a Death Knight hero card, which is a little bit confusing on Blizzard's part, unfortunately. Even during the reveal stream, Kibler himself got confused about that. But these are actually a new subset of Death Knight specific kinds of cards. Much like we've seen with Ysera or their Dream cards, these are Death Knight cards. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Death Knight cards, because that does have a lot of influence over the Lich King himself. These are the 8 Death Knight cards, and forgive me for not having a higher quality image here. Had to grab this pretty quickly. This is just grabs from the reveal stream itself, but you can see all 8 cards here, and essentially most of them are spells, just one weapon there with Frostmourne, which is a pretty important weapon to have, so I am glad it's making the cut here for Arfus. I don't know if I want to spend too much time on all of these. You can kind of parse them yourself. They clearly all have crazy strong effects. Some of them have pretty considerable downsides. For instance, Doom Pack, you do get like a Twisting Nether for 5 mana, but you also have to sacrifice some of your own deck to do so. So maybe not ideal in a lot of control environments if you are expecting to run through all of your cards. That could leave you a little low on resources. But stuff like Death and Decay up there in the top left is fantastic. Frostmourne itself looks really cool because just a 5/3 weapon's nice, and that Death Rattle is nuts, so once you actually exhaust your weapon or your opponent decides to remove it, they essentially get punished because you resummon a couple minions. A very slow card, but still a lot of value, and that's probably a theme for a lot of these. So the only issue here, of course, for me, and what makes the Lich King, himself, a little bit problematic is just how these are all so different. Essentially, they each do something very unique, and it won't necessarily be what you need. Like Anti-Magic Shell is about building your board, so you might get that when you need removal. You might get removal when you need to build your board, and it's random, and it's a 1 in 8 chance, which isn't all that high. So if you only get 1 or 2 Death Knight cards off of your Lich King, you may not get the ones you need, and they might be totally useless. I feel like the Ysera Dream cards, although also have some sort of specific utilities, are a little bit more flexible than what the Death Knight cards look like here. So I'm not sure that the Lich King, unfortunately, is going to be that amazing. I mean, he's an Ironbark Protector, no matter what, which is fine. It's a solid body, a good taunt. But the inconsistency of the Death Knight cards themselves probably leave a little bit to be desired. So you might have to have some other synergies or ways to get multiple Lich Kings out. You know, some sort of way to summon taunt minions like Hadronox or something, right, to actually get full value out of this guy. And since that requires a lot of extra pieces, and things like Hadronox don't look like good cards to me, I'm a little bit worried that the Lich King, despite being the big bad of the expansion, might not be that great of a card despite how strong these actual Death Knight cards are. Individually, I just wonder if they are consistent enough or reliable enough cards to actually be what you need when you need them. I guess, you know, probably half of them work in almost any scenario. Like Obliterate's good, Death Coil's really flexible, Death and Decay is just such a strong card, Army of the Dead's a good board swing. So I suppose it's okay at the end of the day, no matter, as long as you don't get a couple that are absolutely against your strategy. So I have hope for this card. I don't think it's terrible by any means. It's strong, it's cool, it's the Lich King. I'm just not convinced it's a 5-star card by any means. I think it'll come a little bit short, and only certain decks will really be able to run this. I don't think this is the new Dr. 7, Dr. Boom kind of card where it's in every single deck. So this is not Dr. 8, I should say. This is just the Lich King, and he's just an okay card in some control decks, is my guess. So now let's move on to Arfus. Oh, I guess this is the Lich King's loyal ghost sidekick. A new 4-mana 2/2 beast with a death rattle. Add a random Death Knight card to your hand. So really the same problems that plague Arthas, or the Lich King, excuse me, for me also plague Arfus, the dog here. Arf. That's really bad. Because it's just, you know, are you going to get what you need? You're going to get a strong card, no doubt. So this kind of looks like, you know, a 2/2 that draws you a really good card. You know, it's like a super loot hoarder or maybe a polluted loot hoarder with a little worse stats. Does have some beast synergies to consider with things like Druid and Hunter. But I really do think this one's just a little too slow on the board. Because, you know, maybe you play this assuming you're going to get a nice removal spell off of your Death Knight card, but you don't. You get the buff card, and it's useless, and you sacrificed a good turn 4. Maybe there's some Death Rattle synergies, sure, beast synergies, but still I think they're probably better on-board cards to run. So as cute and as funny as this one is, I still think the Death Knight cards themselves are just a little bit of a problem, so I don't think Arfus is going to be all that strong. So now let's move on to the new Warlock Death Knight, the Bloodreaver Gul'dan. 10-mana Death Knight here, with a battle cry, summon all friendly demons that died this game. So kind of a N'Zoth style effect, right, where you just fill up your board with stuff. You also get the 5 armor, of course, and a new hero power called Siphon Life, which is a targeted 3 damage ping, which is really, really good, by the way. So it's like a fully upgraded Shadow form for Priest, which is ridiculous. And it has lifesteal, which is even more ridiculous. That's crazy. So you deal 3 and you heal 3 every single time you use it. That's going to be fantastic for killing minions, setting up trades. It's going to be a ton of pressure on your opponent's face while also denying them pressure because you're healing yourself. So like a super hunter hero power, right? That's just an absurdly good hero power, right? The longer that's on the board, it's just going to have a huge influence on the game. Of course, the summoning demons too. If you can get 4 or 5 demons out of Bloodreaver Gul'dan, it's a great finisher kind of play, much like N'Zoth. I think there are a couple downsides, though, for Bloodreaver Gul'dan compared to N'Zoth. First off is that, you know, there aren't that many great demons that Warlock typically wants to run. Of course, Zoo sees a few with Voidwalker, Flame Imp, and those things. There are some strong mid-rangey ones as well. Doomguard show up from time to time. Abyssal Enforcer is a good card. Those are solid bodies, and particularly Doomguard's great to get off here because it will have charge and you can use it instantly. So there are some demons you'd like to see. My biggest concern is there aren't really any big taunt demons. Like I said, there's the Voidwalkers, a couple other taunt demons, but not ones that you probably want to play in a deck that also runs Bloodreaver Gul'dan because they have really, really big downsides, like Lakari Fellhound, for instance, the new one from Unguro. Which means to me that if you do play Bloodreaver Gul'dan, there might just be an instance where you play a lot of stuff and your opponent can ignore it and just kill you anyway, or just board clear it, because unlike Death Rattle minions with N'Zoth, this is even more susceptible to full board clears, the Twisting Nethers of the world, or the new Arthas removal cards, right? So they don't have Death Rattles, in other words, to repopulate the board immediately after they're cleared, which gives N'Zoth some of that resiliency that Bloodreaver Gul'dan is going to lack. So I'm worried this is not going to be as good as N'Zoth, and frankly, N'Zoth is already not that strong. I mean, it's a great card. It makes its way into the meta, but it's not like a dominant finisher in the meta. It's not the primary way we win games today in Hearthstone. So if Bloodreaver Gul'dan is not as good as N'Zoth, and N'Zoth is already not a dominant card, will Bloodreaver Gul'dan actually be that good? I'm a little doubtful. I mean, the hero power is the real saving grace for me, not the actual really strong battle cry here. Just because I think that hero power over a long term is going to be very, very, very good. But I do think if you find yourself in a position where playing Bloodreaver Gul'dan and utilizing that battle cry successfully is safe, and you're able to do it, you are probably winning the game pretty handedly anyway, and this won't really give you much of an advantage. So in other words, I do think this is more of a win more card than a swing style card, and you probably have to compromise your deck with demons that don't make a lot of sense together to actually fit Bloodreaver Gul'dan and make sense with it. So this one seems to come up a little bit shy for me, even though I want to love it. I love how powerful it looks, and this crazy strong hero power all looks good at first glance, but the more I think about it, I have a feeling this card is not going to actually be that dominant. I think it will fall short. So let's take a look at another Warlock card here. This one's Drain Soul, which will look and sound really familiar because this is basically Drain Life, a card that already exists. But of course, that one's 3 mana, and this one actually can benefit from spell damage in a more unique way than Drain Life because the heal on Drain Soul is tied to the damage, whereas with Drain Life, the heal is kind of worded separately. So the heal does not increase with the damage done. So obviously this is a 10 times better card than that card because it's cheaper and it has more upside. Now, that doesn't necessarily make it a good card though, because that's not a played card right now. And I think Drain Soul's okay here just because a 2 damage ping is nice. If it was 3 damage, it would obviously be significantly better. Get it into that Frostbolt, Dark Bomb range. This looks a little bit more like a Flame Geyser, but I think 2 health is worse than the Flame Elemental you get and that additional synergy from elementals that you get with a card like Flame Geyser. So I don't really think Drain Soul is going to be a very useful card for Warlock. I just don't think it packs enough punch for running the card in your list or for its mana cost, so it doesn't look like this one's going to get played to me. So up next is the new Warrior Death Knight hero card. This is Scourgelord Garrosh, an 8 mana hero card, 5 armor of course, and the battle cry, equip a 4/3 Shadowmourne that also damages adjacent minions. So we've seen that effect before on a number of cards in the past, like Magnetar Alpha and Foe Reaper. Never really picked up a lot of popularity, but always seemed like a fairly strong effect because you can essentially, trade into the 0/2 totem and still kill the really big thing next to the totem successfully without sacrificing your health, which is nice for minions and also, of course, nice for a hero's face like it would be with Scourgelord Garrosh here. So I really like the idea of Shadowmourne. I mean, it's going to give you a ton of influence over the board. You'll be able to often remove 2 to 3 things with a single swing of your axe, which is going to be really efficient removal over 3 turns, which is great. And then you also have this Bladestorm here, which is essentially just Whirlwind on command for free for 2 mana. So in other words, for free, not utilizing a card, but of course at a 2 mana cost. So a little more expensive than a standard Whirlwind effect, but still, you don't have to use a card. So it's always there anytime you need it. So you are sacrificing a lot of defensive potential with Scourgelord Garrosh because you're losing your armor up, but you're gaining a ton of synergy with Enraged style cards, the Acolytes of Pains, all of the other damage-based minions you have in Warrior and the neutral set that can all kind of fit together. We've seen that successfully utilized in Tempo Warriors, of course. Patron Warrior back in the day loved this kind of thing. And there's new cards coming, too, to support this archetype. So it seems like Blizzard's really pushing the Whirlwind Warrior in Knights of the Frozen Throne, and Scourgelord Garrosh seems like it could fit that. So maybe this is the swingy kind of card you put at the end of a mid-range Tempo Warrior style deck to help you stabilize the board really successfully and then just deny your opponents with constant whirlwinds all the time, chipping away at their stuff while also building really successful boards yourself. And if armor is a concern, you can always add those armor smiths in, right, to even make this whirlwind effect a defensive tool as well. The only downside is that, doing damage to your minions, although clearly has synergies with certain cards, it still does do damage to your minions. So this hero power theoretically hurts you just as much as it hurts your opponent, despite all those extra synergies, which makes me a little bit worried because you don't really want to constantly AoE your board every single turn. Sometimes it's going to make the math weird on trades or put your minions in range of damage that you didn't want them in range of. And you won't otherwise have utility from your hero power if you do have to hold it back. So I'm not sure that the long-term value of Bladestorm is worth it when you compare it to something like Taunt Warrior's new hero power, for instance, where it just gets to hit the opponent for 8 every turn. It seems like Taunt Warrior is going to have a much more powerful impact via its hero power than will Bladestorm, because eventually stuff gets big, and eventually stuff doesn't die to whirlwinds. Eventually you run out of executes, and this hero power starts to look worse and worse over the course of a long game. So maybe this, like I said, is sort of the top end of a mid-range deck, and it makes sense there. But I'm not sure this is great in other instances of Warrior, certainly not in a Pirate Warrior deck, and certainly not probably in a really late game or Fatigue-style Control Warrior deck because you lose all that defensive potential. So I think Scourgelord Garrosh is a fine card, just looking at it by itself, that probably only works in a little bit of kind of a small slice of the total potential of Warrior decks out there, which is fine, just not a card we're going to see every day. So up next is Death Revenant, a new 5-mana minion for Warrior. It's just a 3/3. Has a battle cry here that obviously synergizes with Scourgelord Garrosh. We just saw this gains +1/+1 for every damaged minion on the board the instant you play it. So if there's a couple damage things out, it becomes a 5/5 for 5. Not ideal, it's okay, but that's all it's got. If there's like 6 damage things out on the board, it can become a 9/9 for 5, which, you know, is a good play, but not a great play. I think it's going to be way too hard to satisfy the conditions on this Battlecry to make Death Revenant a very good card, because top end it's, you know, a Fell Reaver or a Bittertide Hydra without the downsides, but most of the time it's probably like a 4/4 or 5/5, you know, 6/6 if you're getting really lucky consistently, so it's just not going to pack enough punch for a 5-drop. There are better options out there. Even in a Whirlwind style deck, there are better cards for you that are going to give you more consistent results and a lot more upside than Death Revenant, so this one just seems like a throwaway card a bit for me. So up next is a new Druid card, the Strongshell Scavenger, a 4-mana 2/3 with a Battlecry. Give your taunt minions +2/+2, so obviously designed to synergize with all the new Scarab cards, the 1/5 taunts that have been given to Druid in this expansion. So basically a lot of those 1/5 taunts become 3/7 taunts, which are much nastier to deal with, of course, because 3 attack trades so much more favorably than 1 attack does. So just giving all those things a little extra bite, essentially, those Scarabs. But I still don't think Strongshell Scavenger is going to be that great, because when you do compare it to something like Houndmaster, for instance, that's a 4/3 that gives a minion taunt and +2/+2 for 4 mana. So the stats here compared to Houndmaster are much weaker. Now, the potential upside for Strongshell, of course, is that it can give that buff to multiple taunt minions, and there can be multiple taunt Scarabs out on the board. But that's a little bit harder of a condition to satisfy than just a single beast. And often when you play those Scarabs out, your opponent is probably going to be trading into multiples of them, because you're trying to stabilize and playing really defensively, which means you're from behind. So unless you can combo out Strongshell Scavenger in a single turn, then I don't think it's going to get much more than +2/+2. And other times it's just going to get 0/0, and it's a really bad 4-drop. So since this one's pretty situational and conditional, I feel like it's pretty often going to come up short. I hope it works out, and I hope it finds a place in the meta with a Taunt Druid deck, because that'd be awesome. I love how annoying and defensive that is. I just don't think it's going to do so. I think it's going to be too hard to make it work. So Strongshell Scavenger probably won't be a card we see very often. So up next is the Bone Baron, a new 5-mana minion for Rogue. This one's a 5/5 with a Death Rattle and 2 1/1 skeletons to your hand, and I really think Bone Baron's just too slow. He doesn't do anything instantly for 5 mana. The Death Rattle he gives you just adds 2 single 1/1s back to your hand, and they don't do anything special. So, I mean, in total, you basically have to spend 7 mana to get 7/7 in stats. Nothing exciting there. I think the idea is using those cheap minions to set up combos for Rogue in a Death Rattle deck where it can otherwise be kind of difficult to find cheap stuff to fuel those combo style cards. So I get the thinking here. It's just a really slow play. A mere 5/5 on 5 doesn't do much. The Death Rattle is value based and hand based, not board based, because they're not being summoned immediately. You do have to replay those later. So I don't think this is even good enough for a Death Rattle Rogue deck. It's certainly no Tomb Pillager, which is kind of the closest card you could think to combine it with, right? Tomb Pillager being a mana cost less, having the same attack value, and giving you a coin is just 10 times better than Bone Baron, because it's a much higher tempo play and not nearly as problematic for speed issues. So Bone Baron, not a great card here. I think this will be a pretty easy throwaway. So up next is a new Hunter spell called the Toxic Arrow, a 2-mana spell. And you deal 2 damage to a minion with Toxic Arrow, and if that minion survives, you give it Poisonous. This seems like a really weird card to me. So I mean, obviously it's Flame Geyser, 2 damage for 2 mana. Again, 3 damage would be so much better. So that's a little bit of a downside right there. It's no quick shot, right? And this second condition, if it survives, and give it Poisonous, that feels like such a hard thing to utilize. So the idea is, right, if you have like a 1/3 on board that's not worth much, you can use your Toxic Arrow on the 1/3, turn it into a 1/1, and then trade it into the big minion across the board. But there's already a card that successfully handles that, which is Hunter's Mark. So this has, I guess, a little bit more flexibility than Hunter's Mark, which is interesting, but you have to have a minion on board to satisfy this condition. You still have to trade that minion in, which doesn't feel great. Of course, you still do that with Hunter's Mark as well, but this doesn't work with Hounds like Hunter's Mark does, where you can summon a Hound and instantly Hunter's Mark something. So, although this has a slightly increased flexibility in some ways, it's a lot harder to work with in other ways because your minion has to have at least 3 health and still be something you want to trade in, and that feels really wonky and really unnatural to me. It doesn't seem like this is ever going to be something that you want to do, and certainly doesn't feel like a card you want to run in your deck. So I think Toxic Arrow feels pretty terrible to me. So up next is another Rogue card. I don't know how I got a Hunter card in the middle of the Rogue cards, but what are you going to do? This is the Spectral Pillager, a 6-mana 5/5, with a combo effect, deal damage equal to the number of other cards you've played this turn. So, I mean, this is a Fire Elemental for Shaman, right? But the Battlecry effect, instead of it constantly being 3, as it might be with Fire Elemental, is variable. So it could be 5, it could be 10, it could be 0, it could be 1. Well, I guess it couldn't ever be 0 if you're actually activating the combo. It'd have to be at least 1 if the combo goes off. But of course, you don't always activate the combo, right? So sometimes this would just be a 6-mana 5/5. A lot of the other times, it's going to be like a 6-mana 5/5 that does 1 damage or 2 damage. And I really don't think that's very good compared to something like SI7 Agent, which gives you so much consistency without so many conditions to meet. And you get that Battlecry ping effect at a much lower overall mana cost. Feels a lot better and a lot more useful and a lot more high utility because you can kind of slot it into your turns. I don't really know who runs this card. Even if you do get like 5 cards, gives you Backstab Prep, Counterfeit Coin, whatever your chain of cards is in a Miracle style deck. It's not that much better than like a Fire Elemental or a Blaze Caller or some of those other cards, which already don't get played a ton, even though they're fairly strong and make a lot of sense. It's not like they're dominant cards. So even on the absolute high end for Spectral Pillager, it doesn't feel like that strong of a card to me. And there's a lot of problems trying to satisfy that high roll and high end aspect of the card. So the consistency issues make this another fairly weak card in my opinion. So up next is another Rogue card. This one's called Doomerang. Yet another unbelievable pun. The guys at Blizzard have knocked it out of the parks with puns in Knights of the Frozen Throne. Can't get enough. This is a 1-mana spell. It allows you to throw your weapon at a minion, and then much like a boomerang, after it hits something, it will return to your hand. Well, I guess that's not entirely true, because I think a boomerang that hits something probably just stays there. I don't think it actually returns. But who cares about the actual, this is a fantasy game, we don't care about physics or reality, right? So anyway, as far as how this card works, it's pretty cool. So, you equip your weapon, you use this to essentially get a direct damage spell that doesn't require to use your face to take damage, and then the weapon is added back to your hand. So essentially you save that last durability and convert it into the card again. So you can get, pseudo infinite weapons. Well, I guess you can get basically 2 extra, because you could probably only run 2 Doomerangs in a given deck, but still a lot more extra value out of every weapon that you include in your deck, and also some defensive utility. So I think this was incredibly fun from a fantasy standpoint. I'm a little bit worried about actually utilizing it though, because I feel like it probably creates this weird sort of choke point with weapons where you've always got to spend all this mana on your weapons, and you don't know if that's good enough because you're taking damage, and you probably have to run a lot of weapon synergy cards, and it really restricts your deck. So I just don't know how this one gets used. I'm having trouble envisioning this one in a deck that makes a lot of sense for me, or even in a turn, really, that feels that advantageous. I'm not even sure how it interacts with things like Envenom Weapon, because I think it might still be the spell that does the damage and not the weapon, so I don't think it can be used like as a poison effect in that scenario. So I think this one looks cool, looks really, really fun and awesome. It feels like it's not going to be worth the card slot in your deck. I don't think it's terrible, I just think it's going to be hard to use, basically. Up next is a new Paladin card called Dark Conviction, a 2-mana spell that sets a minion's attack and health to 3, so the same effect we've seen with Keeper of Uldaman and Sunkeeper Tarim. But Dark Conviction is just a spell, and it does not actually have a body attached, which I think makes this a little bit less efficient and probably just a weaker card in general, because there's not as much stuff attached to that single card draw and that single resource in your deck. So maybe some synergies in a spell-based, or excuse me, a buff-based deck to cheat out your, Last Kaleidosaur quest stuff. makes sense there. It's a good debuff card, but when you think about other polymorph style cards or debuff style cards, they tend to silence stuff like Hex or Polymorph and debuff the stats. And all this really does is debuff the stats. So even though it's a cheaper card, I don't really see the use there. And there are better buffs available to Paladin at similar or slightly more mana cost. So I don't really see the value as a buff either. Feels like one of those tweener cards that other cards already do this better and fit decks better than this one ever will. So I don't think Dark Conviction is going to be played very much. And then up next is another new Paladin card. This is the Arrogant Crusader, a 4-mana 5/2 with a death rattle here that we've seen before, and we're going to actually see again in another card in the next review I think. But essentially it's one of these where it's conditional based on the turn the minion dies, and essentially punishes your opponent for trading into this minion. And with this death rattle in particular, if it's your opponent's turn when it dies, this guy summons a 2/2 ghoul. So essentially your opponent is going to have to, if they don't want to summon the 2/2 ghoul, wait for you to utilize your Arrogant Crusader and then make a trade into their stuff so that it dies and doesn't summon it. And therefore you get to utilize the 5 attack that you otherwise often wouldn't get to. And you're happy about that because you probably get to trade up. The problem for this card is it's still a 4-mana card, and 5 attack for a 4-mana card is not really that strong. A lot of 4-mana cards have 5 attack without this downside. And frankly, even if you get the 2/2 ghoul off this and your opponent does make a trade, they just had to kill a 2 health thing to get it, and you get another 2 health guy. So you get like a 4 health total. Theoretically 7 attack, but it probably doesn't work out that way because of how easily both these die. So this one feels like trash to me. I think it's just too weak. Not disincentivizing enough for your opponent to actually ignore the trade with Arrogant Crusader. So I don't really see Death Rattle synergies. I mean, there are potentially some Divine Shield kinds of synergies if you can trade this up with Divine Shield and keep it around. But even then, I don't think it makes sense in a Divine Shield deck because you don't want to have to give it Divine Shield all the time to make it work. So Arrogant Crusader looks fairly bad to me. So up next is a Druid card called Nash, which is not an accident, I'm sure, because this is basically Bash for Warriors, if you remember that card. But instead of doing just 3 direct damage and gaining 3 armor, this one actually gives your hero 3 attack. And that makes it considerably worse than Bash, because you do have to use your face to attack with that 3 attack. So this is just like Bite or any of those cards, but not as good. It's kind of like a Feral Rage too, right? But you get both instead of splitting the difference and choosing one. But the aspect of Feral Rage that makes it so nice is that flexibility is really, really valuable. Because sometimes in matchups you need the 4 damage, whether it's killing the opponent or making it clear. Other times you really desperately need a lot of health. And you get to choose which one you need. And also, of course, there's extra Fandral, Staghelm synergies with Feral Rage, whereas there's not with Nash. So this just feels like a junk card. It's worse than Bash, worse than Bite, really, probably, or at least very much the same. Just take the numbers down a little bit, right? But it doesn't work through taunts. You take damage to make it work, and you basically negate that armor almost immediately as soon as you use it. So I don't really see how this one fits or how this works or how it's better than tools that Druid already has access to. I think this is another throwaway card. And then finally I have 2 Shaman cards, the first of which is Avalanche, a new 4-mana spell that freezes a minion and deals 3 damage to adjacent minions. So this is basically like a multi-shot for Hunter, right? It does 3 damage to 2 things, but it's a targeted multi-shot, and it has a freeze effect bundled in as well. And I think this is a pretty cool little card. As I've said 1,000 times before, and this joke has been made forever and ever, no pun intended, it's just a cool card. Because basically here, right, I mean, this is a positional card, much like Meteor, right, where there's probably a big thing in the middle and a couple small things on the sides. Your opponent can sometimes punish this, but just having a targeted freeze is valuable because there is sometimes big stuff you just need to stall out. Obviously, Shaman also has some new freeze synergy cards that can combo with this really well. But doing that 3 damage like that is very powerful. Just, you know, often it will line up where this is going to kill a thing or 2 against a lot of boards. So in the right kind of deck that needs some defensive utility or some freeze synergies, I don't see why Avalanche couldn't fit. It's going to feel awkward to use sometimes, much like Meteor is awkward to use sometimes. But other times it's going to be exactly what you need to buy yourself some time or just remove a couple troublesome minions. And it's the kind of thing that's going to be solid in Arena too. punishing positioning mistakes. Probably less consistently seen in Constructed, just because it's going to require the right deck to make this one work. It's not going to be a one-of in every Shaman deck by any means. It's not that kind of card. That doesn't make it bad necessarily. It just means the right sort of tools and deck to fit around it are required to make it good. But once it's in that environment, I think it'll be just fine. This is a solid card, nothing incredible, but really not as bad as some of the other ones we've seen in this list so far. So I think Avalanche will do just okay. And then finally a card that was actually revealed the day before, but one I didn't quite get to. This is the Snowfury Giant, an 11 mana 8/8 elemental that costs 1 less mana for each mana crystal you've overloaded in the game so far. So basically a thing from below, but with overloads instead of totems, or of course an arcane giant, right? But with overload crystals instead of spells. And that basically means that Snowfury Giant works really well in a deck that has a ton of overload. It's hard to say for me if that's going to be a good thing. These kinds of cards can be great, though, of course. We've seen with Arcane Giant, a very successful card. Of course, thing from below. I do think that 11 overload crystals is probably a medium target to hit. There's a lot of stuff that does like 1 or 2 that are good cards, the Lightning Bolts of the world, the Feral Spirits, the Lightning Storms. So you probably have to get pretty far into a game, turn 6, 7, 8, before you probably even get this down to like 5, 6 mana. And you have to go fairly late into a game before this gets to 0. So I do think it's going to take a while for this kind of card to become a really high tempo 0 mana 8/8. Which could be problematic for it. Plus, of course, you probably have to include some extra overloads in your deck specifically to trigger this, because I don't think Shamans, as we see them today, run enough overloads that consistently, so you might have to make it a control deck that runs Earth Elementals, that sort of thing, to really reduce the cost here. And overload can be problematic to work with, depending upon the meta and the deck it's in. So I feel like this is probably just going to be a tad too awkward, but if somebody finds the right list and a deck that makes sense in the meta, that just naturally runs a ton of overloads, then Snowfury Giant could certainly become an important part of that deck. 0 mana 8/8s are strong plays across the board, so it's important. I think the 11 mana cost in this card might also be important for things like Evolve and Devolve. I think that creates a new mana cost that we haven't seen before, so it might open up some interesting options there, as well as sort of a side effect of this card for Shaman, a class that uses Evolves and Devolves. So it existing might be more important than it actually being run in constructed format, because I think it's going to be tough for this card to find a home. So there you go, guys. That was a ton of new cards. One more review to go after this one, but before I finish up this part 14, I do want to, of course, hit my quick reviews, where I'll rate each of these cards, from 1 to 5 stars. So let's go ahead and jump into those reviews. Up first is the Lich King. I think this is a 3-star card. I think Arfus is a 2-star card. I think Bloodreaver Gul'dan is a 3-star card. I think Drain Soul is a 2-star card. I think Scourgelord Garrosh is a 3-star card. I think Death Revenant is a 1-star card. I think Strongshell Scavenger is a 2-star card. I think Bone Baron is a 1-star card. I think Toxic Arrow is a 1-star card. I think Spectral Pillager is a 1-star card. I think Doomerang is a 2-star card. I think Dark Conviction is a 2-star card. I think Arrogant Crusader is a 2-star card. I think Nash is a 1-star card. I think Avalanche is a 3-star card. And I think Snowfury Giant is a 2-star card. And there you go, guys. That wraps it up for part 14 of my review. Don't be alarmed by how many 1- and 2-star cards there were in this review. Remember that Blizzard does tend to save some of the weaker cards for the card dump right at the end of the expansion reveal season. So a lot of those cards were in this. It's pretty normal to see some bad cards at this point in the reveal season, so don't be alarmed. It doesn't mean the expansion sucks. There's plenty of cards, lots of cool new synergies, some interesting new archetypes. There are going to be new good decks coming out of Knights of the Frozen Throne. I promise you that. So all of that said, guys, if you have any thoughts, comments, or questions about these cards, my comments on them myself, anything else, of course, I'd love to hear your take in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.